Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing the book, The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden. I looked this book up in Goodreads and I found that it got rave reviews. People seem to love this book and I wondered why it was. I expected this book, like most self-help or business management or sales books, to just be empty platitudes, tautologies, catchphrases, but not much of anything insightful. Kind of like that other book I read, Getting to Yes, about negotiating, which actually did offer good concrete advice, by the way. You can see that video in my history, by the way. But this book got great reviews, and my best guess is because of three reasons. Number one, it offers concrete exercises you can do at home that are used by psychiatrists. The main exercise that Nathaniel Branden relies on is called sentence completion. It involves sitting down with a piece of paper in front of you. In this piece of paper, you have specific incomplete sentences that you have to complete quickly and without thinking. This sentence completion is supposed to give you an insight into your subconscious. He uses that exercise a lot throughout the book, and I find that to be actual concrete advice and kind of fascinating. Now, the second reason I think people love this book is because it does offer some radical messages, namely the idea of objectivism. Nathaniel Branden was a student and lover to Ayn Rand, and he definitely shared her opinions on selfishness being a virtue and altruism being evil. So I imagine a lot of people who maybe didn't know about Nathaniel Branden's background picked up this book hoping to read a book that might maybe cheer them up or lift their self-esteem a little, and boom. They got hit with this revolutionary message that, quote, you should not be the means for other people's ends, and other people should not be the means for your ends. Or the idea that, quote, actually, it is easy to be sacrificial, but it is hard to be selfish. Case in point being that people sacrifice themselves every day 1,000 different ways. Now, as a libertarian, this is all old news. I've heard it all before, but imagine being new to the non-aggression principle and reading these messages in a self-help book telling you that you are entitled to look out for your own interests and that not only should you not feel guilty about it, but you should feel you're doing the moral thing. The third and final reason why I think people enjoyed this book is simply because, similarly to the Bible, certain phrases probably resonated with certain readers. Even if this book was full of empty platitudes are cool. By platitudes, I mean things that you already knew. Like, for example, to have better self-esteem, you need to have courage. He says something to that effect in different words, and you already knew that. Everyone does. At one point, he said, quote, if we don't develop self-esteem, the consequences are varying degrees of anxiety and self-doubt, in a sense, inappropriate to existence. End of quote. Then he said, quote, but of course nobody thinks of it in those terms, end of quote. And I think this quote basically summarizes what I'm trying to explain here. Everyone knows low self-esteem brings self-doubt, but to phrase it as inappropriate to existence is more original and clever. And he explains, quote, but of course nobody thinks of it in those terms. So he knows that he's bringing more original way of phrasing things that we all already know. Now, I don't know that he brought any new insight of studies and statistics into the book. Of course, the man was a lifelong psychotherapist and dedicated his life to studying psychology, so I don't doubt that he was qualified to write a book on self-esteem, and I don't doubt his claims are backed by evidence. But the whole book seemed like general statements verbalizing what we all already know about self-esteem, but doing it in a different light with phrases we wouldn't think to use, catchier phrases, eloquent phrases. And that's what most writers of self-help/business books do. That's the essence of the self-help/business book. Kiyosaki or Carnegie, Joel Osteen, or I imagine Tony Robbins, all these dudes are eloquent writers, even if all they offer are platitudes. By the way, I'm apparently not the only one who thinks this book is full of platitudes. There's another YouTube video out there of a guy summarizing this book. And the dude literally just reads the chapter headings and then just guesses what the chapter is about with examples that have nothing to do with this book. Like, you can tell he didn't finish the book, but he's probably going to get thousands more views than this video will, but it's not a big deal. It's just weird that, like, nobody in the comment section seems to tell that the guy literally just clearly didn't read the book. But anyways, what I personally enjoyed from this book was a couple things. I enjoyed the little insights, aka gossip, he brought about knowing Ayn Rand. He is open and frank about his failed marriages, and he is frank about his infidelity. At one point he mentions that he, in his life, struggled with self-esteem and made the wrong choices. One example he gave was keeping relationships he should not have. I'm guessing that's partly Ayn Rand and partly all his other ex-wives. It sounded to me like he still was remorseful about his past relationships. He went into some depth dissecting his marriage to Barbara. So I guess even at that point in his life, he regretted his marriage. That caught my attention. I wonder how much remorse he still held from it, even at his age. He said regarding his affair with Ayn Rand that he was relating to an abstraction. He was relating to the author of The Fountainhead and not to the woman right in front of him. End of quote. And also said that their needs weren't aligned. He said he delayed doing what he had to do and created more problems by it. He also says that Ayn Rand didn't like disagreements among her close circles. His description of Ayn Rand was that she tolerated disagreements from shallower acquaintances, but from her intimate relationships demanded enormous enthusiasm for every single thing she said and uttered. She showed lack of empathy sometimes. Her self-congratulatory remarks were excessive, her pontificating unworthy of her. This reminds me of Walter Block, his impression of Ayn Rand. He said that she basically had a cult. I also enjoyed that this book explains something I was always curious about. I read Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. I'm going to make a video about it in the future. And if you read that book, you get philosophy, self-esteem, philosophy. The mention of self-esteem always seemed out of place, and it seemed forced whenever I heard Ayn Rand talking about self-esteem. She would crowbar that into philosophy. She even brought it up in her television interviews. And now, after reading this book, I understand where she got all that talk from. Nathaniel Branden. What Nathaniel Branden said, there is no such thing as too much self-esteem, and those with high self-esteem are often a target for those with poor self-esteem. According to Branden, those envious people with low self-esteem try to convince others that, quote, there can be too much self-esteem, end of quote. Does that sound like Atlas Shrugged to you, or does that sound like Atlas Shrugged to you? Now let's list some of the advice he gives from the books. So I'm going to just list it rapid fire without really any order. So he emphasizes that nobody can bypass the need for self-esteem. According to his definition, self-esteem is being able to cope with the needs of life and being worthy of happiness. He also emphasized the importance of logic and consciousness. He talks about rationality. He says, quote, consciousness is the basic tool of survival, which is a concept Ayn Rand would often say. I read the same statement in Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. One piece of advice that caught my attention was his advice about self-acceptance. He says, self-acceptance is selfishness in the best sense of the word. Part of self-esteem is accepting our feelings. We need to accept our feelings. For example, in case you don't want to go to work today, say it out loud. Say, I don't want to go to work today. Think it. Acknowledge your feelings. Experience them. Accept them. And then go to work. Accepting your feelings means absorbing them into your consciousness, experiencing unwanted emotions. It does not mean liking or condoning. And it's important to accept yourself to build self-esteem. If there's something you don't like, you first need to accept it to change it. We should accept others and likewise accept ourselves. In the self-acceptance chapter, he mentions an exercise that requires looking in the mirror for 2 minutes, maybe even in the nude, and taking notice of how you feel when you look in the mirror. It also sounds like interesting, pragmatic advice. Someone asked him if the source of self-esteem comes from the fact that we're all God's children. Nathaniel Branden says that if that's the case, then we're all equal under God, and if that's the case, then it's not really valuable to have God's virtue. I remember Ayn Rand emphasizing in her interviews that you cannot love everyone indiscriminately. So this syllogism that Nathaniel Branden says has some Randian roots, or maybe it's the other way around, I don't know. Continuing with the advice, one important part in his client's progression is when the client realizes no one is going to save them, no one is coming to help. They are alone. Moving on, improving self-assertive mannerisms improves self-esteem, even your body language. Moving on, if you want a marriage to work, you have to make it your conscious goal to make it work, not say, I wish it works out, not to leave it to chance. And furthermore, your goals have to be specific in order to have measurable goals. He explains the importance of keeping your word. Don't just preach, act, and don't act in contradictions. People trust congruence and distrust incongruity. Integrity is important. Keeping your word matters more than other people finding out if you kept your word. In other words, you have to convince yourself that you keep your word. What others think of you is not as important. He also says it's important to know the limits of self-responsibility so you don't blame yourself for stuff beyond your control. The idea of the original sin, for example, is anti-self-esteem by its nature because you don't have control over it. Some of the examples he gives, like this one, are anti-religion. Other examples involve misogyny and racism. I wonder, even though he was a prominent figure in libertarianism, I wonder if New York liberalism had influenced him. Like how they say Fox News anchors are liberals just because they live in New York and LA for so long. They just become liberal. So I do see some sort of progressive ideas in his tone, even though I guess progressivism has changed a lot over the years. So who knows? He says he loves the Spanish proverb, "Take what you want," said God, "and pay for it." He also brings up a good objection he's heard others ask about his philosophy. So other people ask him, doesn't the advice he's giving require self-esteem to begin with? In other words, to live consciously or to have integrity, you need self-esteem to begin with. Yet, this is a book about how to get self-esteem. His answer is that it's a snowball effect, where more self-acceptance brings more self-esteem, and that brings even more self-acceptance. Nathaniel Branden takes care to detail how to apply these ideas to children. This seems to be a delicate topic and an ordeal in and of itself. I'm assuming from all those years practicing therapy and seeing so many screwed up adults, he learned how delicate child rearing is. The purpose of parents is to raise a competent, self-sufficient human, according to Branden. They need to have the security of a firm base first, and then the security to someday leave it. Quote, the value of a child as a human being should not be on trial, end of quote. So in other words, he's saying the value of a child should be unconditional, which, by the way, isn't in conflict with Ayn Rand's beliefs. He continues, quote, love is not felt to be real when it's always tied to performance. And he laments that too many people felt this way as children. I want to repeat that sentence. Love is not felt to be real when it's always tied to performance. I take that to mean, yeah, you should reward and punish a kid depending on their behavior, but they should always feel your love even when they screw up. He says kids should feel like they are enough, and he clarifies, when a person states, I am enough, that doesn't mean that person has nothing more to learn. He says kids should not be praised indiscriminately or praised too much. He also mentions that kids should be criticized in a way that describes what they did wrong, not criticizing their character. Their character should not be judged. Their actions should be criticized. Kids also need consistent parents who mean what they say and say what they mean. Nathaniel Branden pointed out that schools can potentially be a prison for kids if the teachers are bad to them. I like it that this intellectual takes the side of, a little kid, like Pink Floyd or something. Anyways, I like this chapter on how to raise kids. This book was definitely not just a book full of empty platitudes. According to Nathaniel Branden, the concept of self-esteem emerged consciously in the West. Even though it was present unconsciously for thousands of years before that, he says that everyone holds what might be called a cultural unconscious in them, which is exactly what you think it is. It's exactly what it sounds like. He goes on to say, in their cultural unconscious, tribal societies tend to hide the individual and sometimes ignore him. Pride is labeled a vice, self-assertiveness is suppressed, And there's many other ways. Nathaniel Branden says that what was so historically extraordinary of the creation of the United States was that it consciously rejects the tribal premise. The Declaration of Independence declared the doctrine of inalienable rights and asserted that the government was created for the individual, not the individual for the government. This is probably why he attributes self-esteem to the West. I really loved reading Ayn Rand in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, praise the Founding Fathers. I truly believe that woman was a genius, and also Nathaniel Branden. Nathaniel Branden goes on to say that people carry with them history. And even though Americans repudiated the tribal premise, the culture of their ancestors brought it back to America. Some ancestors escaped religious persecution, but brought with them religious authoritarianism. He emphasizes the importance of culture. Bad culture harbors passivity, entitlement, depression. I don't know where Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden would stand in today's immigration debate. I do think it's pretty clear. Immigrants we bring from other countries have a tendency to espouse socialist ideas. Moving on to another topic. Nathaniel Branden says that sometimes to gain self-esteem we just need to overcome nothing more than laziness. The frequency that laziness gets in our way is underrated. Other times the hurdle in our way is discomfort. This is often a big deal, and he states that perseverance, courage, is needed in this instance. Nathaniel Branden finishes the book by saying that the love we have for our own life is the seventh pillar. There's that quote from the Federalist Papers that, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And libertarians are often told this quote as an explanation of why libertarianism doesn't work in the real world, right? We need laws because men are not angels. Well, if all men practiced Nathaniel Branden's precepts, perhaps we wouldn't need laws. But then again, there's been many causes in history that people have espoused as the solution to the world's problems. Reason and logic, thought Ayn Rand. Psychoanalysis, thought Freud. LSD, thought Timothy Leary. The new Soviet man, thought Leon Trotsky. Deconstructionism, thought Jacques Derrida. Islam, thought Muslims. Mutually assured destruction, thought John Nash. And countless other causes we've been bombarded as the solution to world problems. There's even that quote, all kidding aside, if everyone did yoga, we would have world peace. Of course, I don't want to misconstrue Nathaniel Branden and put words in his mouth and say that he espoused his crusade for self-esteem as ardently as the previously mentioned intellectuals espoused their little cause. I'm not saying that I'm sure he didn't believe that, but it's just a interesting little, ironic observation. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you want to see me review the Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand. It really encourages me to see likes. So thank you.